They were laughing, and he had never heard that sound before. Russell Corbin stopped mid-step outside the surveillance room when the sound reached him through the speakers. Soft, light, almost fragile. Laughter. It didn't belong in this house anymore, not since the day their mother vanished from it. There was a time when Lila and Noemi's laughter ruled every corner of the Corbin home, a time when their mother, Madeline, filled their world with warmth. Stories at bedtime and quiet prayers whispered into their hair. But that life ended the night she was taken away under the label of unstable, her tears dismissed as hysteria, her warnings written off as delusion, and the twins never recovered. They stopped laughing first, then they stopped talking. Then, slowly, they stopped reaching for anyone at all. Doctors blamed trauma. Russell called it temporary. The house learned to live with the silence, until Tiana Rowe arrived, a young black maid from a forgotten part of the city, hired quietly to replace others who never lasted. She was warned about the twins, their moods, their distance, their condition. But no one warned her how empty the house truly felt. She didn't avoid the girls. She spoke to them softly. She lingered when others hurried away. She treated their silence like pain, not disobedience. Russell never noticed. He was too busy preserving control and forgetting grief, until the day the cameras betrayed him. And for the first time in years, he heard a sound his home had been mourning. Laughter, and somewhere beneath the shock, beneath the confusion, beneath the guilt, something stirred that felt dangerously close to grace. Sometimes what God revives first is the sound we thought was lost forever. What had the maid done to awaken what even a mother's absence could not heal? Before we continue, please like, share, and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's dive back into the story. The sun rose on Bellevue with a chill more suited for winter than early spring. Inside the Corbin estate, the kitchen looked like a magazine spread, every surface gleaming, every jar aligned, every crumb hunted and banished. But beneath the order, there was something hollow. Lila and Noemi moved with identical steps, identical silences. Their aprons were perfectly folded, their braids identical, their backs never slouched. They didn't run. They didn't laugh. They simply existed, like shadows that had learned how to mimic life. Tiana watched them from across the island, rubber gloves on, a tray of unbaked biscuits in front of her. She had seen quiet children before. But this was different. There was no curiosity in their eyes, no defiance, no delight. They didn't ask for snacks, even as the aroma of warm butter filled the air. They waited for permission to drink water. "Can we knead the dough now?" Noemi asked softly, hands folded like she was in school. "Of course, sweet girl." Tiana smiled, masking her concern. She slid the bowl toward them and stepped back, letting them get flour on their fingers. They hesitated, then moved, still too careful. Even the flour cloud that erupted as they pressed the dough didn't make them giggle. Their faces were blank canvases, lightly dusted in white. Tiana glanced at the corner of the room. Russell was standing behind the glass wall that separated the kitchen from his home office. Not in the room, not with them, just observing. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable, as if he were monitoring a science experiment, not watching his daughters. The twins never turned to look at him. Tiana shifted her weight, trying to ignore the stiffness in the air. "What kind of cookies do you girls like?" she asked gently, hoping to stir something. Lila glanced at her sister. "We're not supposed to say," Noemi replied. "Who told you that?" She looked down. "Nobody. It's just how it is." Tiana blinked. That was not an answer. That was a sentence, soaked in something deeper. Conditioned silence. Unspoken rules. The kitchen was spotless. But this kind of clean wasn't pride, it was pressure. This was the kind of clean that screamed if you broke it. The kind of clean that punished. Still, she watched the girls with quiet patience. They were touching flour, at least. That was something. Then, just as Tiana turned to place another tray into the oven, she caught it. A whisper. Feather soft. Barely there. Mommy used to let us touch the flower. She turned slowly, heart catching in her chest. Noemi hadn't meant to be heard. She looked up, lips slightly parted as if she regretted the words the moment they left her mouth. Tiana knelt beside her, lowering her voice. Your mommy? Neither twin answered. But the way they glanced toward the hallway, the one place they never entered without being summoned, said enough. The name Mommy hadn't been said like a memory. It was spoken like a secret, a forbidden one. Outside the glass, Russell was gone. Tiana stood, her hands trembling just enough to smear flour across her apron. Some homes are spotless, and still starving for warmth. Staying with stories like this is how we remember what really makes a house alive. But inside Bellevue, a question had been planted, blooming like mold in a locked cabinet. Why was their mother's name spoken like a secret? What happened to the woman who made this house feel alive? And why does no one speak of her now? Dust clung to the corners of the old family office like it had been told to stay quiet and obey. The room hadn't seen life in years, maybe longer. Tiana moved slowly, her fingers grazing the edge of a leather-bound desk that smelled of cedar and secrets. She hadn't meant to wander here, but one of the twins, Noemi, maybe had dropped a crayon, and it rolled beneath the heavy door at the hallway's end. When Tiana reached for it, the knob had turned too easily, unlocked, unwatched. Inside, the air was still, too still. Stacks of books lined the walls, classics, ledgers, old recipe books. And on the desk, nestled beneath a moth-eaten cloth, sat a small drawer, locked. She tugged gently. It didn't budge, but the key was already in the keyhole. With a slow twist, the latch clicked open, and the drawer slid forward to reveal what the rest of the house had carefully erased. Photographs, dozens of them. There she was, a woman with soft brown eyes and smile lines drawn from years of real laughter. Madeline. She stood beside the twins, one on each hip. They were smaller then, maybe 3, covered in flour and joy. In another photo, she kissed the top of Lila's head as Noemi clung to her apron. There were crumbs on the counter, toys in the corner. Life. Tiana's breath caught in her throat. The woman in the photo looked like she belonged in the house more than any of the framed art in the halls. She wasn't a ghost. She had been here. She had mattered. Behind her, the sound of soft footsteps. She turned. The twins stood in the doorway, frozen. Who's this? Tiana asked gently, holding up a photo. Lila's lips parted, then closed. Noemi stepped back. We're not supposed to talk about her, Lila whispered. Who told you that? No answer. Just the same silence that kept wrapping itself tighter around this house. Later that day, in the kitchen, Tiana brought up the woman again, casually, like mentioning the weather. Madeline seemed like she was a great baker. A staff member nearby, a cleaner, froze mid-swipe. Her voice dropped low. We don't talk about her. The air changed. Even Russell, when asked directly, shifted his gaze toward the window. That part of the past is behind us. Let's keep it there. It wasn't grief in his voice. It was avoidance. Too neat, too rehearsed. But behind that tidy denial, something unraveled. Because houses don't hide joy. People do. And suddenly, the silence didn't feel like mourning, it felt like a warning. A memory blinked open, like a door cracked in a dream. Madeline's voice shook, barely above a whisper. I'm not leaving them, Russell. Don't ask me to disappear. They need me. Her hands trembled, not with fear but love. A mother's kind of love. Ferocious, defiant, but the room remained cold. And the man before her only sighed, turning his back to the plea. Some houses hide the truth behind marble counters and curated silence. But the twins remember. And memory doesn't vanish, it waits. What happened to the woman the twins still remember? What if the truth isn't buried, but locked in plain sight? The office was minimal. Cream walls, a single plant, a couch that looked like it had never been used for anything other than agreement. Russell sat straight, legs crossed neatly, voice even. They're not traumatized, he said, his tone clipped but polite. They're structured. I've built stability around them. Predictability. It's how they feel safe. Across from him, the therapist jotted a note, but said nothing. A pause lingered. Russell continued. After what they went through, boundaries are vital. Emotional regulation is everything. And what about joy? The therapist asked softly. His lips twitched. Not quite a smile. Joy is earned. Back at the estate, Tiana picked up a plate the twins had cleaned and stacked without being asked. The girls moved through their routine like they were in a silent ballet. No steps missed, no footprints left behind. But she'd started noticing the cracks, like how they froze when someone raised their voice, even in another room, or how they whispered sorry when they giggled too loudly while playing a board game. That particular day, Noemi had clapped her hands in delight after a win. The sound had echoed just once before her face changed, like she remembered the rules and realized she'd broken them. Sorry, she whispered quickly, glancing around. You don't have to be sorry for laughing, Tiana had said, but the girls had already quieted. Later, while folding laundry, Tiana overheard two staff members speaking in hushed tones near the back hallway. It's why she's gone, one said. Emotionally unstable, they said. Couldn't handle the stress. She didn't look unstable, the other replied. She looked tired, sad. Tiana stepped back from the doorway, heart rattling. Emotionally unstable? The words repeated themselves in her mind like an accusation. She remembered the photo in the drawer, the softness in Madeline's eyes, the way the girls still looked at her picture when they thought no one was watching. Tiana set down the folded towels and walked out, the walls around her suddenly feeling tighter. He'd told the world she was unstable. But was that the truth or the excuse? Some call it discipline. Others call it damage dressed up in routine. How many times has love been buried beneath control and called order? This isn't just a story. It's a mirror. Stay long enough to see what most people try to hide. Was instability the truth or the excuse? What happens when a child starts to remember more than they're supposed to forget? Dust whispered secrets as Tiana stepped into the narrow storage room behind Russell's office. She hadn't meant to be here long, just looking for an extra power cable someone claimed was in an old drawer. But the quiet in this part of the house felt thicker. Boxes lined the shelves like silent sentinels. Outdated files, faded envelopes, forgotten things. She reached into the bottom drawer of a weathered desk tucked beneath the window and pulled out a tangled mess of cords. But as she moved the clutter, her hand brushed something hard and metallic, a small recording device. She paused. The red light blinked once, then flickered to life. A faint crackle. Then, a voice raw and trembling filled the room. They think I'm the danger. The air shifted. Tiana froze. But I'm the only one listening to my daughters. It was Madeline. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was alive. Frightened. Fierce. Tiana held the device closer, her fingers shaking. They say I'm unwell, that I'm unfit. But have they ever sat with them? Have they ever listened to what the girls say when they think no one's around? They're scared. Not of me. Of him. Of the silence he demands. There was a muffled sound, a breath caught in grief. Or fear. Or both. I write letters they never let through. I speak, and the walls listen. But no one else will. And if one day someone hears this, the audio crackled again. And then the line that broke something inside Tiana. If someone ever finds this, believe me. Tiana stood still, the weight of the words wrapping around her like a chain. Russell wasn't in the house at the moment he'd left for a late meeting, trusting the structure of his routine to maintain order while he was gone. But this recording wasn't disorder. It was a cry. The kind that doesn't scream but whispers until it disappears. She sat down slowly, still gripping the recorder. Madeline hadn't vanished in chaos. She had faded beneath control, and someone had made sure her side of the story stayed locked in a forgotten drawer. Tiana exhaled. This wasn't just about good parenting versus bad. It was about something far more insidious. Truth made invisible, and she had just found a voice that wasn't supposed to be heard again. Some truths are hidden not because they're wrong, but because they're inconvenient. If your heart still listens, staying with this story matters. Tiana looked down at the device. heart pounding. What will happen if Russell ever hears this? The drive to Evergreen Ridge was quiet. Russell preferred it that way. Silence gave him the illusion of control. But today, the silence pressed heavier than usual, and for the first time, he wasn't sure he welcomed it. The facility stood at the edge of the forest, its white walls clean, its windows still. It looked more like a retreat center than the place where his daughter's mother had been kept. He stepped inside, a file folder clutched under his arm, his name pre-cleared for access. An administrator led him into a quiet consultation room. "Here are the documents you requested," she said, sliding a thin stack of medical records across the table. Russell sat. He flipped through the pages, line by line. Diagnostic impressions, therapist observations, medication logs. But something was off. The diagnosis was vague. Acute emotional dysregulation with signs of anxiety. No clinical tests. No standard evaluations. Just notes filled with words like seemed, appeared, might be. Nowhere did it say Madeline posed a threat. Nowhere did it mention harm, only difficulty adjusting, emotional intensity, and persistent attachment to maternal role. Russell frowned. "She fought to stay involved," he murmured aloud. "She did," a quiet voice said behind him. He turned. A nurse stood at the door. Late 40s. Tired eyes. "I shouldn't say much," she whispered, glancing behind her. But she wasn't like the others. Never violent. Never incoherent. Just heartbroken. Russell swallowed. "She cried a lot at first," the nurse continued. "Spoke about her girls every day. She asked to call them. To write. We passed the requests along, but she trailed off. She didn't need to finish." Russell looked back down at the forms. The words blurred. Madeline hadn't been lost to madness. She'd been erased through process. A page slipped loose from the bottom of the stack. Russell lifted it, brow furrowing. His own signature. Date stamped. Initials. Final authorization for voluntary commitment. His hands went still. He had signed the papers himself. Believing the story. Trusting the professionals. Never asking the right questions. She hadn't been dragged away. She had been buried beneath the system he gave permission to. He exhaled sharp, shallow. And suddenly, control didn't feel like safety. It felt like something else entirely. Some lies are dressed as help. Some betrayals hide behind polite paperwork. And some choices, once made, ripple through generations in silence. If you've ever trusted the wrong voice, this story still belongs to you. Russell stood, paper still in hand. What else had he signed away without reading? The scent of vanilla and warm sugar hung in the air, drifting through sunbeams that cut across the Corbin kitchen like gentle fingers. For once, the granite counters weren't spotless. A dusting of flour misted the air, settling on aprons, noses, eyelashes. Lila giggled as Noemi tried and failed to crack an egg with one hand. Yolk sliding down her wrist like a golden ribbon. Tiana laughed softly, brushing her hand against her apron as she leaned in to help. "There's a trick to it, but the mess is half the fun." The girls beamed. Their smiles, unmeasured, wide, unafraid, seemed to bounce off the walls and land where no joy had touched in years. The kitchen, always a shrine of order, now pulsed with life. Flour marked the floor in powdery prints. Bowls clinked, whisks danced. A tray of misshapen cookies waited by the oven, the kind of imperfection no one bothered correcting. It was the first time the house had looked, lived in. And then, the door opened. No footsteps, no warning. Just the creak of the hinge and the shift in air. Russell stepped into the room. He didn't speak. Tiana turned just as the laughter died. Noemi dropped her spatula. Lila took a tiny step back. Both girls turned toward him, not with delight, but dread, their faces closed like shutters, hands folded, shoulders pulled back. Stillness returned. Tiana watched the shift, heart sinking. It happened in a second. Fear, trained and automatic, slid across their faces like a veil. But Russell didn't shout. He didn't scold. He just stood there, frozen. His eyes flicked to the counter. The mess, the flower prints, The crumbs. The joyful wreckage of something he had never permitted. And then his gaze landed on his daughters, their cheeks dusted with sugar, their smiles gone, their backs tense, his knees buckled. Tiana moved instinctively, catching the edge of a stool to steady herself as Russell dropped down to it like gravity had finally found him. He pressed a hand to his mouth. This wasn't the version of his daughters he knew, not the polished, silent shadows who moved when called and spoke when asked. These were children, messy, glowing, alive. They looked like Madeline's girls. The realization struck like a blade. Tiana watched, unsure whether to speak, but Russell wasn't looking at her. His eyes never left the twins, and they were still afraid. "I'm not angry," he said, but his voice cracked. Neither child moved. He looked at their hands, covered in flour, stained with joy. "This is what they've never had," he whispered. It wasn't loud, but it was honest. The most honest thing he'd said in years. Some homes are quiet because they are whole. Others are quiet because joy has been disciplined out of them. If you've forgotten how it felt to feel safe, maybe this story is remembering for you. As Russell stared at the little lives he'd organized into silence, one truth wrapped around his chest. What did it cost them to finally feel safe? The study was dimly lit, the fire in the corner hearth down to coals. The only sound was the soft ticking of the wall clock and the steady thrum of silence that had settled into the walls over the years like mold. Russell sat in his chair, elbows on knees, face in hands. Across from him, Tiana stood with something small in her hand. The recorder. She had debated for hours whether it was her place, whether truth delivered too late still mattered. But in the end, it wasn't about her. It was about the girls, and the woman no one spoke of. "I found this behind your office," she said quietly. "You should hear it." She placed it on the desk. Russell hesitated, fingers trembling slightly. Then he pressed play. The room filled with crackle. Then her voice, "Madeline," soft, tired, but clear. "If they ever seem quiet, it's not discipline. It's grief." Russell sat back, breath caught in his chest. "They keep saying I'm unstable. But is it unstable to notice when your daughters stop laughing? Is it unstable to ask why they flinch when someone raises their voice? I wasn't the one who made them afraid. I was the one who stayed up when they had nightmares. The one who learned which twin hated thunder and which one chewed her sleeve when anxious." The audio skipped slightly, then resumed, more urgent. "I tried to speak, but every time I did, I was told I was too emotional, too involved, too much. They called it mothering when it was convenient, and madness when it wasn't." Russell's throat tightened. He hadn't remembered her like this. Not clearly. He had painted her absence with professional words and quiet explanations. But this was not a woman unraveling. This was a mother silenced. "If someone finds this, tell my girls I didn't leave them. I was pushed out of the picture because someone wanted the frame to be cleaner, tidier, easier to explain." Tiana stood still, watching a man be unraveled by truth. "They said I needed help. And maybe I did. But not the kind that took away my voice. Not the kind that turned love into a liability." The recording grew quieter. "Just a whisper now. If you're listening to this, believe me." Silence returned. Not the kind that kept peace. The kind that carried aftermath. Russell leaned forward, both hands on the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. "She loved them," he said, voice raw. Tiana nodded once. She saw them. He covered his face, breath catching. Then the tears came, not quickly, but completely. No defense, no control. The dam had broken. Every system he had built, every routine he had praised, every emotion he had stifled in the name of stability. It all came crashing down in the sound of her voice. He hadn't protected them. He had preserved a version of the house that could only survive if love was exiled. And now, the echo of that mistake lived in two small girls who apologized for joy. Some stories don't end with villains. They end with realizations. And sometimes, that's even harder to live with. If you've ever mistaken silence for safety, this story is yours too. The first sign of change was not loud. It was small. Noemi laughed. Not the polite giggle she'd been trained into, but a real one, bubbling and bright as her sister accidentally spilled orange juice on her own socks. Lila shrieked, and the two collapsed in giggles, tangled on the kitchen floor. Russell stood in the doorway. He didn't correct them. He didn't reach for a towel. He let the moment breathe. He had been doing that more often, letting joy make a mess, letting his daughters exist as children, not extensions of his structure. The house had softened. A little. The sharp corners of routine dulled by intentional silence. The perfect rows of books, now bent by sticky fingers, and story time. The kitchen no longer a showroom, but a place that smelled like cinnamon and burnt edges. There were no announcements, no declarations, but the shift was real, Tiana noticed. Of course she did. She watched him from across the hallway, as he gently placed a sketch Lila had made, crayon smeared and bent into a real frame. No glass, just reverence. He turned toward her. She was right, he said. No explanation needed. They both knew who he meant. Tiana nodded. He didn't ask her to stay. And so, one quiet morning, she folded her apron, left a note on the counter, and walked away from the house that had finally started listening to itself. She didn't need thanks. She never had. Some assignments aren't about recognition. They're about release. Miles away, at the edge of the Evergreen Ridge facility, a woman sat in a garden that no one else used. Her hands rested in her lap, face tilted to the sun. Her eyes were open but distant. She had not been moved. No legal battles, no dramatic rescue, but something had changed. Letters had started arriving, small ones. Simple, drawings in crayon, clippings from a child's journal. A note that simply read, "We touched the flower today." She did not cry, but her hand moved slowly to her chest, resting over a heart that had almost forgotten what hope felt like. Back at Bellevue, Russell sat on the porch steps. His daughters chased each other barefoot on the lawn, shrieking with laughter. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the grass. He knew what he had taken, what he had broken, but now he also knew what could still be protected. Not everything could be undone, but not everything was lost. He pulled a small object from his pocket, the voice recorder. It no longer played secrets. It played memory. Reminder. A monument to the voice he once silenced. She was still gone, but not erased. Her truth had taken root, and the house was beginning to bloom. Some endings are not celebrations. They are reckonings. Staying with stories like this is not entertainment, it's remembrance. For every unseen mother, unheard child, and unspoken truth, thank you for staying. Not every truth restores what was lost, but it keeps what remains from being built on a lie.